busy plate with people like you and I, generating vast quantities of sensitive data on a daily basis, receiving, transferring, sharing across the four corners of the globe. But who is protecting all of that sensitive data? Who can help eliminate the risks of security breaches? And what if it were you? Accompany a businessman during an assignment. Be his guardian angel. Help protect his data and become foolproof on cybersecurity.
Distinguished panel of speakers, ladies and gentlemen, joining us from around the world today. It gives me great honor to welcome you on behalf of the board and team at the World Trade Center Accra and our partners from around the world. Special mention to Silent 8 to this webinar, which begins our effort in concert with our global partners to throw more light on the issues of international financial crime, cyber fraud, and money laundering, and what we collectively call the 3 ills, and how by tackling these 3 ills, we could improve lives in leaps and bounds in Africa. So having introduced the event, I would like to invite you all now to dive in with us, and I'd like to introduce our distinguished moderator for today, Mr. Scott Mccleskey. Scott is an experienced expert in the field of international financial crime and money laundering, having worked 30 years in this field. He's a certified fraud examiner and a certified anti-money laundering specialist. Scott worked at some point as Senior Vice President at Moody's International, and I'm sure it will be difficult to find a more qualified moderator to facilitate such an important event and topic. So I'll hand over the event now to Scott to take over from here. Thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy your day with us.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I always wind up learning at least as much, if not more, from events like this, and how things are transpiring in Africa is a subject of great interest to me. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to be here today. What I intend to do today, just to start things off, my background as a consultant gives me a bit of a bird's eye view of how things are transpiring with respect to financial crime, with respect to regulation throughout the world. And so I'd like to start off just kind of giving an overview of what I'm seeing before we get into the meat of the presentation. So you know, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Just to give a little bit more with respect to my background, so you know where I'm coming from with this perspective. I've been doing this kind of work for a bit over 30 years now. Right after college, early in my career, I was in military intelligence in the U.S. Army, and then I was a special agent with the FBI. So as you can imagine, I've done a few financial investigations, including money laundering, and that kind of set the stage for a lot of the career that I've pursued since then. After my time in the Army and the FBI, I entered the financial sector. As you can imagine, I was doing a lot of financial investigations there, also enforcing and even writing some regulation. And I've done that not just in the United States. I've worked in Europe for a number of years, and I've done consulting all over the world with an eye to financial crime investigations. I have been a chief compliance officer, so while I was at Moody's, I was actually their first chief compliance officer, which meant that I had to start from a blank sheet of paper and deal with all the issues that a regulated entity deals with respect to how to meet all the various compliance obligations. So that helps bring that perspective to me. For the past few years, I've been a consultant and a trainer, a number of different types of clients, including government agencies, securities markets, stock markets, and a lot of private sector entities as well. And again, this has been all over the world. And so this is something where I get to dig down deep into what's going on in various jurisdictions. And that kind of gives me, as I said before, a bird's eye view of what's going on. So what I'd like to do today with my time before we get into the meat of the presentations is just give that overview of the trends I see with respect to money laundering, terrorist financing, cyber, and the like. I'll talk a little bit about how I see the regulated entities dealing with the requirements that are being placed upon them. What are their practices? What are their issues? And then I'll tee up technology. So you're going to hear from a lot of people that are dealing with or providing technologies. And I just want to say a little bit from my perspective as a non-technologist, how I see technology both creating issues and creating solutions with respect to the fight against financial crime. So I'd like to start with a bit about regulatory trends that I'm seeing going on right now. And I'll go into each of these in a little bit more depth. Understanding and identifying ultimate beneficial ownership is a big thing now. And of course, those of you that are involved in investigating financial crime, terrorist financing, cyber fraud, you know that this is kind of the key to what you're trying to get to. Who actually owns what, who's actually moving the money. But it's one of the most difficult things to get your head around. And this is something that's getting increasing focus from among regulators really around the world. Another thing that I'm noticing is that when regulators are looking at the regulated entities, there's a bit of a shift from how big is the entity to what kind of risk is it posing. And I'll go into more depth in that as well. I'll touch on virtual assets. Now, obviously, we could be here all day talking about virtual assets, and you'll hear a bit more about that, I'm sure, as the day progresses. But I just want to talk a little bit about what I see with respect to the regulatory trends as they address virtual assets. A big thing that's been going on for a number of years, but I think it's critical to understand, is what's called expanding the perimeter. So within the world of what is regulated, what is not regulated, sectors are added over time, and particularly over the past 5 years or so, you've seen sectors that may not be directly involved in financial services, but they actually facilitate or hinder the flow of illicit funds, and now they are expected to meet these regulatory requirements. And so I want to talk about the impact of expanding the perimeter. And one thing that I think is just an overall comment to make that is a theme through all of this is that the informal economy is a major issue. Yes, especially in Africa, but really all over the world. And by that, I mean the transactions that go on outside that perimeter, outside of the regulated world. So we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. So to start with ultimate beneficial ownership, what this really comes down to is you've got an asset, you've got an account, and it may say that John Doe is the account holder, or it may say John Doe Limited is the account holder, but they may not actually be the ultimate. They may be a nominee or a holding company. And so to conduct your investigation, you need to know who that ultimate beneficial owner is. There are some inherent difficulties in doing this, though. First of all, is you have complex structures of legal entities and the use of nominees and power of attorney. That's true even of legitimate entities. So you may have a lot of interlocking ownerships and things, but especially it's true if somebody's trying to hide things. They're going to make things more difficult for you by adding these complex structures. And the way that you have to go about this often is you find one level, and let's say that's John Doe Limited. Now you have to go and find out the documentation for John Doe Limited, and you find out that it's 50% owned by John Smith Limited. Now you've got to go through the same step. But getting this documentation is often difficult. There may be a lack of transparency really in the documents themselves. They're not really that forthcoming. But also some of these entities may be deliberately or otherwise set up in a jurisdiction where it's difficult to get that information in the first place, to get those documents. and you have to go through the mutual legal assistance process, and it could take very long. So these are all problems that are gumming up the process. The regulatory response in recent years has been, in many jurisdictions, to set up a central ultimate beneficial ownership registry that is accessible, if not by the public, at least by the public that have a legitimate interest in doing this kind of research. The EU money laundering directives are mandating this, and it's being looked at in a number of jurisdictions, I think Canada as well. And this is a good development. Having said that, I'm not sure how much it's going to help in the immediate term. I think it's got a lot of potential, and it will ultimately be very useful. But in the end, the registry is only as good as the information that's volunteered to be put in there. And so it will help you get through that process of finding out what's been filed, basically. But we always have to bear in mind that the people that are filing that information, if they are money launderers, may not be entirely truthful and forthcoming. But it is a good step in the right direction, and I think it's something everybody needs to understand is the flavor of the month, if you will, with tackling this ultimate beneficial ownership issue. Focus on risk. This is just an observation of mine. It used to be that when you looked at a firm, you would expect a large firm, a large bank, for instance, to have the best technology. And that's not necessarily the case right now among a lot of the regulators. Now, first thing I'll say is that FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which is the standard-setting body globally, they've been mandating a risk-based approach for a number of years now. So their members are the central banks, the government agencies, and it's telling them that if you want to meet our recommendations, you need to require the entities under your jurisdiction to take a risk-based approach. So that means two things. One is take a look at your overall activities. How much risk do you present with respect to money laundering? And that may drive, frankly, the level of sophistication of your program. But it also means looking within your entity at your different businesses, and are there some that are greater risk and require more controls than others? But having said that, as I mentioned, with the extending the perimeter, new sectors are added, and some of these are relatively small, but they carry considerable risk. And so I think regulators are starting to say, what really matters is not how big you are, but what kind of risk you represent in terms of the complexity or how often these transactions are used for potentially money laundering, the volume of transactions that you're handling, and things like that. So you could be fairly small in that respect. And the other thing to remember is that by being small, they may actually present a higher risk because criminals and terrorists may be seeking out the smaller firms in order to move money. They may need the large banks to move lots, very large amounts, but if they want to fly below the radar, then what they're going to do often is they're going to look for those smaller firms to move the money through. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about pawn shops, jewelry stores, maybe one or two person law and accounting offices. And I think the upshot of this is that if you are a small firm or if you regulate small firms, even those smaller firms are going to need to consider what level of technology they should invest in to meet their responsibilities. I said I'd talk a bit about virtual assets. Now, this is really, I think, maybe the biggest development in money laundering, terrorist financing, obviously cyber hacking, over the past 10 years or so. It's been looked at by FATF for several years now. In fact, I recall not working for FATF, but I was a representative on a U.S. government industry task force, combined task force, back in, I think, 2013, that was looking at this new thing called Bitcoin and looking at the level of risk it presents with respect to money laundering. And we very quickly came to the conclusion that it presented a large risk. So it's been looked at almost from the beginning, but this sector has grown in size and complexity, and so regulation is trying to keep up with all of that. And it's certainly something that if you're looking at potential money laundering, terrorist financing, sanctions evasion, you need to know what is going on in the world of virtual assets. Now, how these things are regulated, I think the most effective regimes that I've seen focus on regulating what are called the VASPs, the virtual asset service providers. These are the nodes within the system where, for instance, the Bitcoin will be exchanged for dollars, or you'll have Bitcoins exchanged for a different type of virtual asset. They also handle the transfer of assets, the safekeeping, where the wallets are. The wallets are just another name for account. So by focusing the regulatory requirements on these VASPs, these virtual asset service providers, there is a touch point, if you will, for regulation where they can require, you need to do customer due diligence, you need to do regulation of record keeping. And so this is, I think, what works best. FATA focuses on this as well. They do an annual review of how's regulation going with respect to virtual assets. And one of the things they focus on is the number of jurisdictions that actually are regulating the service providers. Right now, they're saying progress is being made, but there are a lot of jurisdictions that aren't doing it. So virtual assets, it's mostly being used for money laundering. It is being used also for terrorist financing, for sanctions evasion, but it's probably best suited for money laundering. And by this, as you can see, I'm really talking about paying for illicit sales, for paying for drugs, paying for weapons, paying for wildlife, illegal wildlife trading. All these things where you don't want to leave a trail of where did the money go. And of course that has to do with fraud and particularly cyber hacking as well, where it's all being done online. So that's where the biggest issue, I think, is with respect to the use of these. Now, I said that virtual assets have been around for a while, and they've been around long enough that they've started to develop their own distinctive typologies or distinct typologies. So for instance, if you're a money launderer, you're going to understand where are the jurisdictions where the VASPs aren't being regulated, so you're going to pass through those. You're going to do what's called dusting, which is you have 100 Bitcoins, and instead of putting them all in one wallet, you're going to put 2 in one wallet, 3 in another wallet, and sprinkle them across so that you're creating more complexity. And there are enough different types of virtual assets now. You're not just going to convert dollars to Bitcoins and back to dollars. You'll go through several different iterations of this, because as you understand from your own experience, the name of the game is really about creating a muddy, complex trail. Expanding the perimeter, just the last point on regulation. The focus, really still is on the financial institutions themselves. But having said that, a few years ago, they started doing more regulation of money service businesses. And by that, I mean everything from, say, the Western Union, the traditional money transmitters, and the bureaus de change, the currency exchange stores that you'll see on the streets. Cryptocurrency, so these virtual asset service providers, when they're regulated, usually instead of creating new regulations, they just say you are a money service business and you're regulated as such. And then of course, mobile and online payments, the payments you make by phone, which are particularly prominent in developing and emerging economies. These are often regulated as money service businesses as well. Casinos and online gambling, I'm going to talk about a little bit more later, but they are becoming, they've been added to the perimeter in a lot of jurisdictions, but even where they were already being regulated, they're getting a lot more detailed regulation now. Lastly is a thing called the Designated Non-Financial Businesses and Professionals. That's a mouthful, DNFBP. And these are basically those businesses I mentioned earlier where they may not be moving money, but they're critical elements of the process of terrorist financing, money laundering, or cyber fraud. And so things like attorneys and accountants, they're going to set up a lot of these entities that you're going to have to deal with as you address beneficial ownership. Real estate agents, because the purchase and sale real estate is a big part of a lot of typologies. Dealers in precious metals and stones. We're basically talking jewelry stores, pawn shops, but even if you have a large department store that has a section that sells jewelry, a lot of times they're going to have to go through this regulatory process as well. So moving on to what I see, not from regulation, but what's actually going on in the predicate offenses. And I'm going to cover each of these. Human trafficking is a big one. Corruption is always there. Trafficking in endangered species. I'm not just saying this because I'm talking in Africa. It's a big problem in South America, Asia, a lot of other places as well. Extractive industries. That's the term they're using for mining, but it also includes illegal fishing, in some cases, some agricultural work as well. And I'm going to talk, as I said, about casinos. So human trafficking. Human trafficking has been a problem for a long time. It's becoming, there are a lot more initiatives to address it right now. And one thing that I've noted is that the World Bank has said that with the COVID epidemic, the risk and occurrence of human trafficking is actually going up because the pandemic has resulted in the economic almost collapse in a lot of areas. So a lot of people need employment. They're more willing to do something they may not normally do, sign on for a job overseas, and it turns out to be human trafficking. So it is on the rise. It's not really, it's a separate and distinct offense, but it's always intertwined with other things. Obviously, it's intertwined with money laundering, moving the money around, but it often involves also corruption, paying people to turn a blind eye to what's going on. Child exploitation, so the human trafficking is for child exploitation or sexual exploitation of adults. Drugs, so the drugs have to be harvested. A lot of those people that are picking the poppy in the fields, if you will, are there because they were duped into believing they had a legitimate job coming, and they're being forced to really be slave labor to get the drugs, drug production cycle going. Same thing with illegal extraction, illegal mining and the like. So human trafficking is usually intertwined with a lot of other things. It's typically, but not always, transnational. It's typically, but not always, cash-based, which is going to impact the types of investigations you're going to conduct. And one thing about human trafficking, in my experience, there are very distinctive red flags that you look at in the bank account, what's going on, of the victims, the nature of the deposits, the nature of the withdrawals, where the money is being spent. Is it being spent a lot in hotels and the like? And I think the main point here is that these distinctive red flags exist. It's important that financial institutions understand these, that they're trained by the regulators if necessary, and that they train their people to look for these red flags. And that's an important way to combat human trafficking. Corruption, look, it's always been a major problem. It's not new, but one of the things that we're looking at now is there's more ways to move the money that's being used to pay somebody off, to pay a bribe. It's not just, bring me a suitcase of cash anymore. There's a lot of ways that, money can be moved electronically. Additionally, you all know the Paradise Papers, Panama Papers before. They highlighted not just the means of transporting the money, but its destination. It's highlighted the use of opaque legal structures that are in opaque offshore jurisdictions as a way to hide the proceeds of the corruption. And that, of course, makes it more difficult to investigate. Another thing that I've noticed is the definition of a politically exposed person. It's usually very clear and distinct until you get to, who is this person's close associates. And that's highly dependent on the local context. I've worked in some jurisdictions where somebody may belong to the same social club, and that's a very tight bond. And what it comes down to is that person in a position to ask for a favor of the politically exposed person? And that would make them, in my view, a close contact. And so when you're looking at somebody and you say, well, they're not a close associate of that PEP, you have to take it in the local context. Casinos, and you have to include online gaming with all of this. There's been greater scrutiny on this, I think, because Law enforcement and regulators are seeing more of a wider variety of typologies moving through casinos and online gambling. Now we've got, of course, the direct conversion of cash. So somebody comes in literally with a bag or suitcase of cash, buys chips, plays for 10 minutes, and then says, I want to cash out, give me a check. Okay, that's the very basic form of money laundering through casinos. But there have been a couple of other more complex things that involve casinos. You may have heard of the Vancouver model. I can go over this if somebody wants, and we have time at the end. But basically, it's moving cash through the casino through a very twisty road through local banks, and ultimately it's washed through the casinos, and then real estate is used to purchase it. It happens a lot in Vancouver, and in fact, studies have shown that it happens so much that it has raised the price of real estate in Vancouver. That's how significant a portion of the market is this money being washed through the casinos there. Junket, Macau model also. Usually this involves people that have restrictions on how much currency they can move out of a country like China, but it can also be used for money laundering. And what this comes down to is I'm a money launderer. I've got $500,000 that I need to move. The junket operator, who is a money launderer, will give me a deal where I pay him $500,000. He buys the ticket for me. He buys my VIP suite at the casino and $400,000 worth of credit. So I didn't move the money to Macau or wherever the destination is, but once I'm there, I've got access to it, and then I cash out in whatever currency I want. So this is just to illustrate that casinos are becoming more and more deeply rooted in other typologies. Online gambling, all I really need to say about this is that it's the same as online banking. It presents customer due diligence processes, and it can be very difficult to trace the transactions because you don't always have the same amount of money in and the same amount of money out. Online gaming, this is just something that's really interesting. You know, if you have whatever, Grand Theft Auto, or my daughter has a horse game that she plays in, you buy with real money in-game currency to buy a horse or a saddle or whatever. And I guess what you do is you close the account and you say, give me back my money. Now you've got money coming from Star Stables or Grand Theft Auto instead of money off the street. So this is something that regulators are even looking at now. So that's kind of what I see going on in terms of trends with respect to crime and regulation. I just wanted to touch very quickly on how are people reacting to this, the regulated entities. And I think the first thing I need to say, and it's obvious, the practices do vary considerably. I think it's still safe to say generally that financial institutions are the most advanced. They tend to have greater resources, but more importantly, they've been regulated for a longer period of time. But again, it's just a general statement. As we get newly regulated sectors, think of those pawn shops or that department store with a jewelry desk. They're often falling short. They're frankly not taking it seriously in some cases. Some are, some aren't. But you know, you run a jewelry store or a three-person accounting firm, and you may say, okay, I need an AML officer. I'm the AML officer. I'm going to take a one-page policy or procedure I get off the internet, and there it is. I've ticked the box. And customer due diligence is not going to get in the way of doing my business. And this is where they need to get the message from the regulators and from law enforcement saying, we actually are keeping our eye on you because we understand that size and risk are not necessarily the same thing. I think you do see as artificial intelligence and other types of technology like what we're going to see today become more sophisticated, they're also becoming more affordable. And I do see some of these smaller sectors adapting technology, sometimes through the use of pooling their assets through an industry group. So it's growing, but like everything else, it's not uniform with respect to sectors or with respect to jurisdictions. Now, some other challenges. I'm using the picture here of an old computer for a reason. And that is, the technology is only as good as the people that are using it, but sometimes the technology itself, may be dated. Technology for technology's sake is not always the best approach. You need good technology. Good technology does not involve a complex process. It's built from what I say, the screen to the code, not the other way around. So somebody says, what do I need to see? What's the information I need? How will it be presented most usefully? And it's all about making it easier for the user. That's the most effective way to use technology. I think, my view, this is just my observation, my opinion, the technology supports the human judgment. It gets rid of the clutter so they can focus on what's important, not do a lot of repetitive tasks, but it doesn't replace human judgment. I think, you know, any technologist would tell you the same thing. In terms of major issues, the big problem in whatever jurisdiction and whatever sector you're talking about is the number of false negatives. So whether you're doing this manually or you're doing this with technology, it's an ongoing challenge to get your parameters right so that you're not getting 99% false negatives and going through that. And that's why artificial intelligence, which learns as it goes, is very important. From the regulator's point of view, the really big problem is the quality of the suspicious activity reports or suspicious transaction reports that are coming in. If the people in the regulated entities don't have a good grasp of what makes a good SAR, then you're going to get something that really isn't that helpful. One of the jurisdictions where one of the government financial intelligence units, they've estimated that fully 50% of the SARs that come in are useless because they don't have enough information or good quality information that they're providing. So lastly, I just want to kind of talk a little bit about the challenge and opportunity of technology. Technology is good. You know, it is especially helpful in those areas of the world where you may not have a local bank, but people have financial needs. So on balance, it's good, but it also presents problems. A lot of times the payments are now bypassing the regulated intermediaries, so there's no set of eyes looking at them. Think of things like Hawala, the traditional Islamic payment method where you're not moving money. You're basically setting things up so that one branch tells another branch, when this guy shows up, give them the money. He'll have a password or whatever. And that's even gotten incorporated into some of the money service businesses. One of the jurisdictions I work in, they've got something that looks and feels like Western Union, if you will, but money isn't actually being transferred. It's just a convenient location for people to go and say, I'm supposed to pick up this money. In some cases, the payments by phone or app don't even require access to a bank account. So all of this makes it very difficult to trace. But there are opportunities as well. In the end, in my view, technology is the best and maybe the only way for regulated parties to deal with the volume of traffic that they have to deal with, that problem of the false negatives. They can do all these things, and I'll let the experts speak more about what they can do. But the bottom line is that last bullet. It makes the team that's working on these alerts, whether it's in the regulated entity or in the regulator, faster, smarter, and more efficient. Don't forget also open source intelligence. In other words, the web. All sorts of things you can do this. Whenever I do investigations, I would say I get most of my information, although perhaps not the most important information, through the web. So you can verify things. You know, does this company even have a website? Satellite imagery. Does this company look like it could handle 3,000 television sets a day? Court filing, social media, very good for identifying relationships and related parties. So the challenges, I think, that are presented by this is that in the wrong hands, technology makes your work harder. It makes it easier to create more transactions and accounts. If you don't have to go to the bank every time you open up an account, or you can do more transactions, wire transfers with the click of a mouse, you can do more of them, and that just exponentially makes a more complex trail. Encryption, I don't think I need to dwell on this. Encryption makes your life harder. Cryptocurrencies in the dark web, this is how a lot of stuff's getting moved these days. In my experience, success doesn't come from trying to bash your way into decoding what's going on in the dark web. If you think about things like how Silk Road was brought down, it was brought down with informants. Traditional investigative techniques where you're able to identify somebody who's involved with it, surveillance, all these things really It becomes an art. How do you adapt these things to the dark web investigations? But that's really where the success is. The last challenge I just want to mention is look, criminals and terrorists, they are highly adept at technology. They adopt these technologies quickly, and so the challenge is to keep up with them as they keep up with technology. And so just to wind things up, I think the major points I'd like to make are, look, this is evolving constantly. You got to keep in step with the technology. The other really big thing that I think in terms of trends from a regulatory point of view is expanding the perimeter and becoming sharper in terms of the detailed expectations that the regulators demand of the regulated parties. And look, criminals and terrorists, they're still going to use the big banks, I think, large amounts of money, but that informal economy, those small enterprises, I think, are being targeted because they are essentially below the radar now, even if they are part of the perimeter. Bottom line, if I were to say one thing, is that technology is no longer something that's nice to have. It's something that you must have. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you. I've put my my contact details here in case anybody would like to contact me and ask any additional questions, and there'll be some time to speak at the end of the session today as well. So having said that, I think I'd like to move into the experts that we have on the panel today. The first person that will be up is Mr. Samson Akligo, who's the Director of the Financial Services Division of the Ministry of Finance in Ghana. And he'll be giving on Ghana's standing in the fight against international financial crime, cyber fraud, and money laundering. So Mr. Akligo is, before he was Director of the Financial Services Division, he was Vice President at Data Bank and Head of Research, and is also a fixed income strategist. So he's worked at a number of places within the industry, and he brings that expertise into his current role. Mr. Akligo, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good afternoon from Ghana. In Ghana, we are in the afternoon. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I think for me, it's actually a great pleasure to speak at this event, and in particular, to address issues of financial sector cybercrime, which at this historic moment. Clearly, the COVID pandemic has heightened the importance of technology and how technology is going to define the future of what we do. Fundamentally, the shifts is going to be that countries must invest heavily in technology and also promote policies that will get more people roped into the technology space, even in terms of financial sector. In Ghana, we have actually recognized this, and we have started making efforts to position the country to be in front of this future. The key institutions that we have that are very important in driving some of this include the Financial Intelligence Center, very important, our regulators, which includes our central bank, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the National Insurance Commission, and then recently the National Pensions Regulatory Authority. In addition to them, we also have important institutions like NITA, that is the National Information Technology Agency, as well as our National Cyber Security Center. All these institutions are very important for the future of making sure that we deepen our financial inclusion and technology space, but most importantly, we start prepared for how these things work and how they are protected against some of the key issues that we are discussing. From 2017, a lot of practical efforts were taken in Ghana to improve digitization and strengthen the financial sector. Some of them, I'm sure we know, but I will just go through, mention them quickly. One of the key ones that we did, even in the period of COVID, was the National Financial Inclusion and Development Strategy. This strategy intends to rope almost 90% of Ghanaians into the financial sector safety net, but most importantly, do that through technology. And one of the key drivers of that is mobile money. With mobile money, we are even confident that in the next 3 to 5 years, about 98% of Ghanaians would get into the financial system and will be using technology platforms to transact money. Another key policy in this space is the Digital Financial Services Strategy, which we also launched just recently. Another important one, again, is the Cashlight Roadmap, which really is supposed to make every strategy we have in the digital financial strategy work. So really, we do recognize the fact that we must take steps to ensure the safety for the future. So as we do this, we have taken some pragmatic steps as well. We have actually set up a high-level team headed by the Deputy Minister for Finance, Kweku Kwarteng, to be in charge of a task force under our factor, leading efforts together with the regulators and FIC to ensure that we address key issues in terrorism financing, money laundering, among others. It is true that the challenges that we face as a country are enormous in the space. Recently, we all hear in the news some of the challenges that banks had with respect to fraud. We also know that the European Union and us have been having conversations on how we can improve our ecosystem, especially for money laundering. So within this scope, the factor have been working very hard to position the country so that we come out of any challenges that we have. On this note, I'm really happy that one of my colleagues who is actually coordinating the task force for factor will do a detailed presentation to us and take us through some of the specifics that we have done as a country. He is Emil Eddy. He's a manager at the Financial Intelligence Center, and he happens to be the coordinator for the National Financial Action Task Force. So Emil, over to you, and thank you very much. After his presentation, we will stand ready to take questions that pertains directly to Ghana.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Sampson. And I'm also happy to be here today to share some of the action Ghana is taking to be able to strengthen their financial system. I'm just trying to share my slide so that we could all watch it whilst I do that, the presentation. So, all right. So once again, thank you very much and happy to be here. So I'm going to just give you a brief on Ghana's standing in the fight against international financial crime and cyber fraud, including money laundering, some new trends, some major vulnerabilities, and government approach to the fight against these financial crimes. Now, I've been made aware to also talk a little about the European Union's publication in May 2020. First of all, I would say Ghana is the first country in the West African sub-region to have subjected itself to the second round of mutual evaluation. And as you all are aware, the Financial Action Task Force has set the standards for these mutual evaluations. So during the second round, it was based on both technical compliance and effectiveness. So by this, we would want to see whether you have the institutions in place, and by effectiveness, you want to see whether the laws are working, the institutions are working. Now, having said that, after Ghana went through the evaluation, certain strategic deficiencies were identified. And according to the FATF methodology, that would mean that Ghana would have to be observed over a period to ensure those deficiencies were addressed. Permit me also to say that the fact that Ghana, the first country in the West African sub-region to have subjected itself to the second round of mutual evaluation, tells you that Ghana is ready to demonstrate its willingness to subject itself to higher standards of financial integrity and compliance. So in May 2020, the European Union, the Commission released a publication adding Ghana to its list of third countries with strategic deficiencies in their AML-CFT regime. And we had some interactions with the European Commission because we feel that some of those actions were not consistent with what is happening on the grounds. So the European Commission indicated to us that the only reason why Ghana has been placed on that list is because Ghana is currently on the Financial Action Task Force gray list. So they were not having any particular issue with Ghana. This is very important because most often issues come up. People ask, why is it that Ghana is the only country in West Africa on the list? Why are the other countries and all that? Well, I would just say that it is because we are the first country to have gone to the second round. We are the first country to have allowed ourselves to be subjected to higher standards of financial integrity and compliance. And that is why Ghana is. The other countries are now in the process of going through their evaluations. Now, it is also important to state that Ghana has agreed on an action plan with the Financial Action Task Force, which it is currently implementing to be able to address all the strategic deficiencies identified in the framework. All right. Now, what are some of the measures being implemented by the government of Ghana, especially with regards to the regulatory agencies to remedy and improve Ghana's standing in the global financial system? In fact, the earlier presenter, Mr. Scott, when Mr. Scott was making his presentation, he talked about how regulatory regimes should be based on risks and not necessarily on the size of institutions. Now, I would say that Ghana has deployed a robust risk assessment methodology for the banking, the insurance, and the security sectors for some time now. And indeed, from the mutual evaluation, it was established that yes, for the banking sector especially, there has been a very robust risk assessment methodology, and that has enhanced how the supervisory and regulatory activity within that sector has improved over the period. As we speak, the insurance and the security sectors have also done same. They have improved upon their system, and it is evident with what is happening within the sector. There is financial integrity, there is soundness of the financial system, and those who may want to abuse the system have been put rightly in check. I would say that we also implementing same for the non-bank financial institutions. And what I mean by the non-bank financial institutions, I'm talking about the savings and loans companies, the microfinance institutions, the finance houses. Again, that reminds me of Mr. Scott's presentation when he talked about some small entities with high risk and all that. The Bank of Ghana, which is a central bank, is currently implementing very robust risk assessment methodologies within these sectors to ensure they raise the level to the standard of the normal banking, insurance, and security sectors. Enhanced risk-based supervisory capacity of regulators. It is not just enough to have a good risk-based supervisory regime. Those who are going to implement the tools must also have adequate capacity to be able to do that. So over the years, Ghana has consistently taken up measures to ensure that the supervisory capacity of all regulators are improved. Indeed, the Central Bank, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Insurance Commission, now the National Pensions Regulatory Commission have all undergone series of risk-based supervisory capacity trainings, both within and without, in order to boost their skills to be able to implement the tools. Improved inspections on risk-sensitive basis. Now, this issue, when it comes to money laundering and terrorism financing, the importance of supervision is key. Now, what happens is that when you have the risk methodologies in place and you fail to implement serious and improved inspection strategies, a lot of people will still abuse the system. And it is evidence in other mutual evaluation reports of certain jurisdictions. So what Ghana has done over the years is to ensure that on a risk-sensitive basis, the regulators focus their activities and resources on areas that pose significant risk to their sectors and ensure that all the institutions operating in such areas comply to the high standards of our AML-CFT regulatory regime. Enhanced outreach towards all stakeholders as regards anti-money laundering. It is also important that in as much as you are implementing measures to ensure people comply with certain standards, you need to also improve the understanding and give them the rationale why they would have to comply to some of these standards. I would say one major, how will I put it? One major factor that helps in improving an AML-CFT regime is to ensure that those who are supposed to comply with the regime understand and appreciate the reason why some of those measures are put in place. Now, failure to do that, then it means that the people wouldn't appreciate and they will raise issues. There's this issue about, for example, profitability versus compliance. If you fail to ensure that stakeholders appreciate the reasons why some of these measures are in place, most of them tend to look at the profitability aspect of business than the soundness and the integrity aspect of their operations. So that has been another effort Ghana has been making to ensure all players within the sector are enhanced, sensitized, and educated to know what is happening, what their obligations are, and why they would have to comply with these obligations. Mr. Scott also mentioned typologies. Yes, indeed, it is very important to every time go through the system to see which areas are posing new risk, which areas are vulnerable, what are the types of crimes happening, what systems people are using to move their funds and all that. And this is very important because people must be able to appreciate the new trends in the system, how people are moving these funds, so that they put in place appropriate measures, commensurate measures to prevent the system from abuse. So the Financial Intelligence Center, for example, working with the other regulators, have come up with some guidance and typology studies. And this has been shared among all accountable institutions. Various sensitization exercises have been carried on with these typology studies for them to appreciate the new risk areas, the vulnerable areas, the means that people are using now. IT is one of the key issues. So what are the systems these people are using in order to move their funds, in order to beat our system, and put in place appropriate measures to curb same. Fit and proper test of directors and key management personnel. Over the period, Ghana has improved and ensured that adequate measures are in place to prevent criminals and their associates from participating in the ownership, control, and management of financial institutions. This is very important because money launderers and those who involve themselves in some of these activities would always, some way, somehow, want to participate in the ownership structure of businesses. The FATF recommendation 2425 talks about transparency of legal persons and arrangements. And it is very key that all jurisdictions put in place adequate measures to ensure people of questionable character don't participate in these ownership structures. Here, I would quickly add, for example, the beneficial ownership, as Mr. Scott rightly talked about in his presentation. So as we speak, Ghana is implementing a central register where the beneficial owners of all companies will be identified, so that law enforcement agencies, competent authorities will have access to the beneficial ownership database in order to assist them during their investigations and during their prosecutions and all that. Regulators Forum. Another important step Ghana has taken in order to improve regulation within the financial sector is to put all the regulators together so that they share expertise, they share information, they share experiences in order to also cure regulatory arbitrage, so that at every point in time, all the regulators within the sector are moving in the same direction. They are sharing information so that what would happen where somebody who cannot use the banking system to launder the money will move to the securities or will move to the insurance shouldn't happen. So we have done this, and I think it has worked very well for us because we meet very often, and you could see that the outcome of some of these forum activities had actually helped other regulators who, one way or the other, were lacking behind, to also come up to the higher standards. Now, another important aspect of the AML-CFT regime in Ghana is to ensure that all accountable institutions take risk assessment seriously. Normally, I say that for you to be able to have a robust system, it starts right from KYC CDD measures. If I walk into the bank and I'm coming to open an account, if I walk into a capital market and I want to buy an investment, the capital market or the bank officials' ability to conduct a proper KYC, that is know your customer, and CDD measure on me is very key to ensuring that continuously I am monitored and prevented from abusing the system. Because if you're able to get your KYC and your CDD very well, then the probability that adequate measures will be put in place to curb any high risk customer is there. Now, what we've been able to do is to ensure that every accountable institution prepare its own risk assessment, taking into consideration the product they offer, the services, the delivery channel, the geographical areas, and also incorporating the findings and recommendations of our national risk assessment so that they have a robust risk assessment system in place. And we always encourage, and the regulators always do that. When they go on site, they ensure that they review your risk assessment to see whether it is accurate, to see whether you have commensurate measures in place in order to curb any risk emanating from any of your customers or your products. Deployment of financial intelligence system. It is not just enough to have a robust supervisory regime. It is not just enough to have a system where regulators are actually monitoring the activities of their regulated entities. Now, you must also have a system in place in order to assist law enforcement agencies during investigations and prosecutions. Now, so what we did is the Financial Intelligence Center has deployed a financial intelligence system, which is largely built on the GoAML, which is one of the major anti-money laundering softwares globally. Now, what the difference here is that we have been able to link our system to the various databases of other government agencies in order to facilitate immediate analysis of information for dissemination of value-added intelligence to support the work of law enforcement agencies. Indeed, I would say that since we've deployed this system somewhere 2018 November, we have seen a massive and significant improvement in the support we offer law enforcement agencies in terms of having access to information, in terms of forwarding intelligence reports to them, in terms of cooperating with them in identifying assets of subjects and all that. And that has also worked very well for us. What are some of the new trends and incidences that we are finding in the system? Illicit financial flows is a global phenomenon, and Ghana is also putting in place adequate measures in order to prevent some of these things. We have various task forces operating in order to cure some of the deficiencies. Mobile money, everybody these days has mobile money accounts, and especially with the COVID-19 coming on board, a lot of transactions are going through the mobile money. And for that matter, it becomes a vulnerable activity. People are hacking, people are actually using the system, defrauding people and all that. But we are working with all the mobile money service operators, and together we are putting in place adequate systems to ensure that some of these fraudulent activities are picked early so that they will be investigated appropriately. We have email hacking, again, largely due to the COVID-19 situation. So there are a lot of online activities. So a lot of people are also taking advantage, hacking into the emails of people and all that. We have payment card fraud, where people some way, somehow happen to use other people to get this MasterCard and Visas and all that, and move out of the jurisdiction to undertake activities. You trace it back and you realize that even the people who own the MasterCards are not aware that their names are being used for these purposes. So we are also working closely with the regulators to ensure that we put in place adequate systems to prevent this. We have the POS fraud, we have the CEO fraud also as well. All All right, so I'll quickly move on to the next slide. Perceived major vulnerabilities. When Mr. Scott was making his presentation, he talked about DNFBPs, designated non-financial businesses and professions. Globally, a lot of focus has been on the banking, the securities, and the insurance sector. And over the years, leaving this group of people unregulated. And I'll say it is not a Ghanaian problem per se, it is a global problem, which every jurisdiction is putting in place some measures in order to ensure that they come under supervision. Largely, you have the accountants, you have the lawyers, you have the casinos and all that. One good thing about our regulatory regime is that, unlike other jurisdictions, some of our DNFBPs already have mandated regulators. For example, if we take the casinos, we have the Gaming Commission that are regulating them. If we take those who are into the precious metals and stones, we have the Minerals Commission there. So what we are trying to do and what we have done over the years is to ensure that all these people factor AML-CFT as part of their regulatory systems, to incorporate AML-CFT measures into their regulatory system to ensure that they are not only looking at the prudential aspect of the activities of these people, but they're also considering the AML-CFT aspect of their activities. We are also working with the lawyers and the accountants. Ghana has put up an AML unit, which is domiciled within the Ghana Revenue Authority, to ensure that all the DNFBPs that don't have a regulator are monitored and are regulated. They have embarked on a series of sensitization activities, and I think that we are in good standing to actually put these people in check. Another area is the non-profit organizations. In fact, from our national risk assessment, the NPOs were also identified, especially for terrorism financing purposes. Permit me also to say that as we speak, Ghana has never encountered a terrorist activity in the country. And as we speak, terrorism financing, evidence of terrorism financing is low. Irrespective of that, notwithstanding that, there are a lot of terrorist activities around us. So it means that we must put in place adequate measures to ensure that there is no dissipation of these activities into the jurisdiction. So we are currently working on a bill, an act for the NPO sector, to regulate the NPO sector. We have been able to put a national policy in place already, and implementation is ongoing whilst we actually work on the bill for the sector to ensure all operators in the NPO sector are adequately monitored and supervised. Of course, the FATF recommendation 1 requires that not all NPOs, but NPOs identified to be vulnerable to money laundering, terrorism financing. So for that matter, Ghana did a risk assessment of the NPO sector, and some NPOs have been identified to be vulnerable. So adequate measures are being put in place to ensure that these NPOs are monitored and supervised to prevent abuse. What is government's approach to fighting financial crime? In fact, it is a national policy of Ghana to engage and coordinate all relevant agencies across the entirety of government in order to combat money laundering, terrorism financing, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. You agree with me that financial crimes, economic crimes, money laundering, terrorism financing is a huge thing, and one institution cannot fight it all. So there is a need for all law enforcement agencies, all competent authorities, all regulators, supervisory bodies come together in a concerted effort in addressing this menace. So the government, for example, in 2019, launched a national AML-CFT policy and action plan. And the aim of the policy is to detect, deter, and vigorously investigate and prosecute money laundering and terrorism financing related offenses. Indeed, I would say that all stakeholders were involved in the development of this strategy, i.e. the regulators, the accountable institutions themselves, law enforcement agencies, the judiciary, and some of the private sector players. We are also working closely with the judiciary because what we've experienced is that from our national risk assessment, there is a kind of a knowledge gap within the judiciary. And I think over the years, we've been able to do very well. Some lawyers have been designated for sitting on money laundering and financial crime cases. And so that has improved. And we are still working with them to enhance the knowledge. Things keeps on changing, so there's always the need to build capacity and to work in a concerted effort. So the government of Ghana's approach to fighting financial crime is about collaboration and cooperation, not only with the domestic agencies, even with the international counterparts. And I would say also that over the years, the government has embarked on an exercise to retool and enhance the allocation of financial resources to law enforcement agencies in order to ensure that they are adequately resourced in order to investigate and prosecute these things. It is important to keep our financial system safe, and the government is determined to ensure that all law enforcement agencies and all other institutions that work in this area are well resourced to be able to ensure that the country is safe and for the global community to have confidence in our system. In conclusion, I will say Ghana remains committed to the fight against international financial crime, cyber fraud, money laundering for the enhancement of national and global economic stability and growth. And the FIC is also committed to partnering with all institutions, both domestic and abroad, in order to move in a certain direction to ensure that we are not only keeping Ghana safe, but we are keeping the global economy safe. It is important that happens so that there will be trust in the system, there will be integrity in the system for us to move on with our development agendas. Ghana is committed, and I would say in conclusion again that we are on our way to exit the FATF grey list, because FATF has acknowledged our efforts and our interactions with them and the reports they have published so far. Ghana is on course, and we are determined to exit the FATF grey list by the close of this year, which would also enable the European Commission to take us off. So thank you very much, and I stand by for any question or clarifications.
If I could just jump in, I think that was a really good presentation. And just one observation, I didn't want to interrupt you, but one of the things that I've seen over the years is that emerging economies often become the most advanced in adopting best practices. I've seen this, for instance, when the communist world collapsed and you had newly emerging economies. And what you outlined reminds me of that in many ways. First of all, you're developing an ultimate beneficial ownership registry, which puts you ahead of the United States among other countries. But also the FIC coming up with the financial intelligence system, leveraging technology to bring this information together. A lot of times the larger economies, they move slowly because they have a lot of legacy processes and legacy technology. So just my observation is, yes, you're on the gray list, you are working out of it, and I can see from what you said why it is that FATF is saying you're actually making progress, and in some ways you're going to be ahead of a lot of other jurisdictions. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you very much.
I think we'll move on next to our next presentation, which will be Mr. Matthew Leaney, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at Silent8, one of the sponsors of today's conferences. And he'll be talking about new technological innovations in the fight against international financial crime, cyber fraud, and money laundering. Matt is based in New York City. As I mentioned, he's the Chief Revenue Officer for Silent8, and he'll tell you a little bit about what Silent8 does. And in that capacity, he oversees all the aspects of growth for the company, and he's constantly seeking new avenues for Silent8's award-winning AI to aid organizations in their fight against financial crime. And I'll just say this as an aside, I've been working with Matt for some time, and he gets it. He understands the complexities of what's going on, and he's uniquely positioned, and I think we'll see that with Mr. Swanepoel as well, to be that bridge between what needs to happen and what can happen. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to you, Matthew Leaney.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you, Mr. Mehdi. Congratulations on a successful move to getting off of those lists. We're working with a couple of other countries who aren't managing to move quite so swiftly. So what you're doing is working. It's brilliant to hear you talk about the DNFBs and the MPOs. That's something that I'm going to touch on a little later on. So just as Scott said, you are leading the pack versus many more established economies who aren't tackling that part yet. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about global financial crime, the status, and how advanced technologies such as AI can help. I've only got a couple of slides. I would love to be interrupted if you have some questions. So here is how we look at the state of global financial crime. If you look on the right, it's the 8th biggest economy in the world. It generates more economic activity than Brazil, Italy, or Canada. Most studies say that the impact on communities is actually 3 to 1. So when you look at a global drag on investment, it's really over $7 trillion, which make it up in the sort of the 3rd biggest impact. So when you think about the money countries spend on drug enforcement and treatment and all of the other crimes that unfortunately go on in our world, you see that is all money that doesn't get spent on healthcare and education and security and everything else that would support in driving our planet forward. So that's a very long way of saying this is a really big problem. Unfortunately, that number isn't decreasing. It is trending in the wrong direction. And what you see is for firms that are fighting the good fight, it's a very noble fight against financial crime. I'm sure many people on this webinar fight that fight every day, that they really aren't winning. It's not for lack of investment, it's not for lack of will, it's just they're outgunned. And regulators continue to impose harsher and harsher fines. Already in 2020, we have had more fines than 2019. And 2019 was the 2nd biggest on record. And the costs of compliance continue to skyrocket. So you've got a sort of a standoff where the economic drag on the planet is huge. The costs for firms to try and fight this on all of our behalfs is huge and rising. And the financial penalties for getting it wrong are also huge and rising. So the status quo is only really working for the people we don't want it to work for, the criminals, because they can spend so much money and be so nimble trying to outwit all of us. And this is where we will sort of move to AI. They have unlimited funds. They have unlimited, they can go through every country in the world. They can try and go through every financial institution in every country in the world. As Mr. Mehdi was saying, they can go to non-financial institutions. The likelihood that as a planet we can prevent every single access point is obviously extremely low. We're spending, we're trying, we're all doing our best, but they're winning. So this is the quote that I want to base this conversation on. If you can't win the game, change the rules. I would suggest to you that using our current rule set, we can't win the game. And what do I mean by rule set? I mean the way that we are approaching financial crime compliance. If you look at the sort of the evolution of our attempts to defeat these criminals, the first sort of stage was an explosion in headcount. So let's screen more people, let's employ more and more people to manage those screening outputs. The challenge, as you all know, is 97% of the work in this industry is clearing out false matches. It is unfortunately the cost of doing this fantastically important job. I would further suggest that, if I was in charge of a fin crime group at a bank and an excellent analyst came to me and said, hey, I think I can capture 5 more true positives a year, but it's going to cost you 50,000 false hits, which means you're going to have to hire 8 people. I work for a for-profit institution. I don't know whether I can always catch the 5 additional bad guys. And that's what I mean about we have to change that. The false positives, the capacity, the cost of this industry is the key inhibitor to innovation. Can we look, as Mr. Mehdi was suggesting, at different types of organization? Can we look at charities? Can we bring in new data? Can we release our screening rules and actually screen more people? Can we create more false positives if AI can help us decide? So this is what I mean when I say this is change the rules. Let's not worry about capacity with advanced technology, because people are expensive. People make mistakes. We all make mistakes. My team at Silent 8, we have a competition each Friday to see who made the biggest mistake this week. I don't always win, but I'm normally there or thereabouts. Yeah, AI is in many ways perfect for this challenge, and I'll talk about that in a second. The second stage, after the sort of explosion of headcount, was then the proliferation of services to try and reduce the supply of alerts. So I can't increase my capacity much more. People are too expensive. Can I decrease the supply of alerts? Can I hide? Can I suppress? Can I risk weight? Can I score? Can I color code? Those were all really effective solutions, I would say, over the last decade. They managed the volume of alerts, kept it low enough so that human beings could handle the rest. The challenge is those alerts actually go undecided, which means true hits will slip through the net, appearing as false hits. Remember, the criminals are putting so much effort into disguising their identity, and we'll talk about some of the ways that we catch that later on. They're putting so much effort into defeating the sort of static rules, risk score alert, and defeating human beings. They're using advanced computing. They're wasting 3/4 of their ill-gotten proceeds to integrate the last 25%. Like, the scale and the techniques that the criminals are using are advanced beyond human beings and sort of hiding away alerts to manage the supply. So we've got to change the game. How do we change the game? We change the rules. We bring in advanced technologies like artificial intelligence. So how does AI help? Sorry, excuse me. How does AI help? Many people think of AI, they've seen it in Terminator movies or other movies where it goes rogue and often does something awful. I was watching a movie last night where AI declared war on humanity. I'm like, that's going to hurt my business, because this is the experience that people have of AI. It's the Hollywood experience. Good AI, true AI, is fully human supervised. AI cannot be creative, outside of the parameters of its programming. So, for example, an AI cannot decide an alert in a way that a human supervisor hasn't given it permission to decide that alert. It can be creative in how it finds the information, but it cannot be creative in how it dispositions an alert. So good AI is fully supervised. Good AI is also fully auditable. So no black box, no secret source. Why did this alert get closed as a false? What evidence did you find? And which human being said, if you find that evidence, you may close this as a false?
Matthew, can I just interrupt to ask you one thing, because you invited interruptions, and so I'm going to oblige. So you talk about the AI can't do anything that the supervisor, whoever that may be, doesn't tell it to do. So does that mean that in the future, people that are going to be doing these reviews need to have some sort of technical background so they can, will they need to code? Will they, how will that will this process be to tell it what to do? Do you have to speak robot?
I don't know how you speak robot, Scott, but we have a conversation about that. Do you speak very slowly and in very short words? Good question, though. Thank you. So no technical requirements needed. You can interact with AIs using very simple user interfaces, drop downs. Just think of it like any other website where you have controls. So the AI, when deployed in FinCrime, is a single model. And then within that model, it can be very creative. So I'll give you a quick example. So let's say you said to an AI, if you find that the customer and the potential watch list match have a date of birth that's 25 years apart, you may call that a false positive. Maybe that was one of your parameters for success. And if the AI can prove that, it can disposition it as a false. So if your customer's date of birth is in the core banking system or whatever other system, and your watch list from Refinitiv or Dow, whoever has the date of birth, the AI can do that very straightforward. Just compares one to the other. But let's say the watch list entity doesn't have a date of birth. The AI can then be creative and go to public sources like Wikipedia or governmental records to find that date of birth and then come back and compare it to the customer. So it can be creative in finding the solution, but it can't decide, for example, that 10 years gap is adequate to disposition a false positive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually very helpful. Thank you.
No, thank you. And please, everyone else, jump in as well. So, like I said, good AI is explainable. It explains what it did. I said this was false because you told me if I find these facts, I can call it false. And this is what I found. And if I went to the internet, here's a screenshot and a URL of where I got it from. That's the crucial part, right? If you think sort of lazily, I could just mark every single alert a false positive and say I'm 97% accurate, right? But it's the proving why that's so crucial, especially when it comes to regulators. Let's talk about capacity. I firmly believe that capacity is the key blocker to innovation. I said that a minute ago. If you take capacity off the table, what could you do? If you didn't have to hire more analysts all the time, what could you do? We hear from our customers over and over again, I'm always 10% analyst short. I'm almost 6 analysts short. I can't have, the analyst turnover is too high. I'm always behind, right? What if you took capacity off the table? AIs have basically infinite processing power. In our standard installation, it can do 2 million a day. If that's not enough, you just add separate AIs to handle maybe one for PEPs, one for adverse media, one for sanctions, and so on. And if that's not enough, you just start breaking it down by country. So infinite capacity. What could that create for your firm? Perfection. AI doesn't get tired. AI doesn't get distracted. AI can't make a decision outside of an approved learning. We have never made a mistake, ever. It's a core part of our business. So what could you do if you knew that every case was perfect? You could solve as many as you wanted. You could explain every single decision to a regulator. Every single thing was auditable, and you had complete real-time control over the AI. I believe very strongly that if we put these sort of things into place, we would have a real impact on financial crime. And this is the last part I wanted to speak about, which is, Mr. Mehdi talked about it a little bit as well. You can bring in more data. You can do more tests. You can be more innovative. AI doesn't need perfect data. It can go and find things from the public internet. What if we started moving beyond financial firms and we started moving into real estate transactions, cell phone purchases, travel? What if we really took the fight to the criminals and said, we're going to make your life a lot worse. We're going to basically box you into where you currently live with no access to the internet. Could we do that? Could we start to move AI beyond financial firms? Mr. Mehdi says Ghana's already doing it. I wish more countries were that innovative and progressive in their thinking. The AI can do the same thing on transactions. Go beyond simply flag me everything that's $10,000 or above. It can look at patterns. It can compare transaction patterns to entities. So you might say you live in this country, but actually all of your checking account transactions are over here, and the cell phone you purchased is over here. Now I've got a red flag, because I don't think you live where you say you live. And if you live over here, it becomes more likely that you're a match to this bad person who we know lives over here. And this is the end state where I think AI can take us. What if you put an AI around a country, a region, maybe even the world? I get a bit carried away when I say that. This is actually a slide taken from a country that we're working with. It's an awful circle to block over the shape of the country with their flag in it, so I apologize for the high school PowerPoint. What we're doing with them is partnering to put an AI between their country and every single access point to their country. Every single one. You want to land at the airport, you're going to get screened. You want to buy a property, you're going to get screened. You want to send a wire, you're going to get screened, but you're doing that anyway. You want to have a relationship with a lawyer, you're going to get screened. This is how we start to change the game. This is how we start to bring the heat, and we say to the nefarious actors, this country is closed to you. Just don't bother. You cannot get in. And that, I think, is how we start to play offense, and how we use advanced technologies like artificial intelligence to bring the pain. We've got to bring a gun to the gunfight. I do think that without advanced technologies, we're still carrying a knife. And with that rosy ending, Scott, that is all I had to share today.
Well, thanks very much, Matt. Very interesting as always. And